The West thought economic sanctions would cripple adversaries, isolate rogue states, and demonstrate the power of coordinated financial pressure. Instead, they triggered something far more consequential: the systematic construction of parallel economic systems that bypass Western control entirely. The weapon is real, but it's pointed in the wrong direction. This isn't about whether sanctions are morally justified or whether targeted regimes deserve punishment. This is about unintended consequences, strategic miscalculation, and the reality that economic coercion, when deployed at scale, fundamentally reshapes the global system in ways that ultimately diminish, rather than enhance, the power of those wielding the weapon. To understand how we arrived at this paradox, we need to examine what sanctions are supposed to accomplish, how they actually function, and why the gap between intention and outcome has grown so dramatically wide. Sanctions are economic restrictions imposed by one country or group of countries on another to compel policy changes. They can target specific individuals, companies, sectors, or entire economies. The logic is straightforward: make the economic cost of certain policies so high that rational actors will change course to avoid further damage. This logic rests on several assumptions. First, that economic pain translates into political pressure. Second, that the targeted entity lacks viable economic alternatives. Third, that the sanctioning powers can maintain unity and prevent sanctions evasion. Fourth, that the long-term costs to the sanctioning countries remain acceptable relative to the benefits achieved. Each of these assumptions has proven more fragile than architects of modern sanctions regimes anticipated. And the cumulative failure of these assumptions is reshaping global economic and political order in profound ways. The modern sanctions architecture emerged primarily after the Cold War, when the United States and European Union began using economic restrictions as a primary foreign policy tool. The logic was appealing. Sanctions offered a middle ground between doing nothing and military intervention. They demonstrated resolve without requiring troops or accepting combat casualties. Iran became an early test case. Sanctions targeting Iran's nuclear program began in the 1990s and intensified dramatically in the 2010s. Iranian banks were cut off from SWIFT, the international financial messaging system. Oil exports were restricted. Assets were frozen. The pressure was unprecedented in scope and intensity. Did it work? The answer is complicated. Iran eventually negotiated the 2015 nuclear agreement, suggesting sanctions created pressure for diplomacy. But examining what happened inside Iran reveals a more complex story. Iranian engineers developed sophisticated schemes to evade sanctions. Shell companies registered in Dubai and Malaysia purchased prohibited goods and re-exported them to Iran. Oil tankers disabled tracking systems and transferred cargoes at sea to ships bound for non-compliant countries. Iranian banks established relationships with Chinese and Russian financial institutions willing to process transactions outside Western systems. More significantly, Iran accelerated domestic production of goods previously imported. Unable to buy certain medical equipment, Iranian companies began manufacturing it domestically, often lower quality initially, but improving over time. Sanctions intended to pressure the regime instead created a protected domestic market that boosted certain Iranian industries. The social impact was profound, but not in ways sanctions architects anticipated. The urban middle class, precisely the demographic most likely to pressure the government for policy changes, suffered most. They had savings in currency that lost 80% of its value. They needed imported medicine that became scarce. They lost jobs as businesses closed. Meanwhile, the Revolutionary Guard-controlled economy actually strengthened, as sanctions made smuggling and black market operations extremely profitable for those with the right connections. When the United States withdrew from the nuclear deal in 2018 and reimposed sanctions, Iran had already built the infrastructure to survive indefinitely under economic pressure. Iranian leaders calculated, probably correctly, that they could endure sanctions more easily than they could accept the domestic political costs of the concessions required to remove them. North Korea presents an even starker example. The country has faced comprehensive sanctions for decades, becoming perhaps the most isolated economy on Earth. The result: North Korea developed nuclear weapons, maintained its political system, and survived through a combination of Chinese economic support and a command economy that simply doesn't function according to the rules sanctions are designed to exploit. But the Russia case represents something qualitatively different, a moment when sanctions at unprecedented scale revealed fundamental flaws in the entire approach. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the United States and European Union deployed what officials called the economic equivalent of nuclear weapons. Russian banks were expelled from SWIFT. Foreign reserves held in Western financial institutions were frozen, an extraordinary step that involved seizing sovereign assets. Exports of advanced technology were banned. Individual sanctions targeted thousands of Russian officials and oligarchs. The immediate goal was clear: inflict such severe economic damage that Russia would be forced to withdraw from Ukraine or face economic collapse. The longer-term goal was deterrence, demonstrating that major violations of international norms would trigger catastrophic economic consequences. The sanctions did cause significant damage. Russia's economy contracted. Access to Western technology dried up. Capital flight accelerated. But Russia didn't collapse, didn't withdraw, and didn't fundamentally alter its policies. Instead, it adapted. And in adapting, Russia accelerated trends that pose far greater long-term challenges to Western economic power than any single conflict over Ukraine. Consider the energy dimension. Europe had imposed sanctions on Russian oil and gas while simultaneously being heavily dependent on Russian energy supplies. This created an obvious contradiction. How do you sanction your own supplier without causing more damage to yourself than to the target? The EU attempted to square this circle through phased restrictions and price caps. Russian oil could still be sold, but only below a certain price. This was supposed to maintain supply while reducing Russian revenues. The result was predictable. Russia simply redirected exports to buyers willing to pay market prices. India and China dramatically increased purchases of Russian oil and gas, often at discounted prices, but with volumes that offset the European market loss. India's imports of Russian crude increased from essentially zero before the war to over 1.5 million barrels per day within 18 months. Indian refiners processed this crude into refined products which were then exported globally, including to Europe. European consumers were effectively buying Russian oil with extra steps and higher costs. China locked in long-term Russian gas contracts at favorable prices, strengthening its energy security while securing discounts that advantaged Chinese industry over competitors paying market rates elsewhere. The Power of Siberia pipeline, which delivers Russian gas to China, operates at increasing capacity with plans for additional pipeline routes. Russian tankers began using dark fleet operations, turning off transponders and transferring cargoes at sea to obscure destinations. Insurance and shipping services, also sanctioned, were provided by companies in jurisdictions that don't enforce Western sanctions. The global shipping industry is so complex and opaque that determined actors can almost always find compliant service providers somewhere. Financial transactions moved to currencies other than dollars and euros. Rupee-ruble trade emerged for India-Russia transactions. Yuan-ruble exchanges grew dramatically. While less efficient than dollar transactions, these alternative currency arrangements proved workable for the volumes required. By 2024, Russia was exporting comparable volumes to pre-war levels, just to different customers. Russian government revenue from oil and gas after an initial drop recovered to sustainable levels. Meanwhile, European industries faced energy costs 3 to 4 times higher than competitors in Asia and North America, accelerating industrial decline across the continent. The economic damage was asymmetric, but not in the direction sanctions architects intended. The financial architecture dimension reveals even more profound shifts. When Western governments froze Russian central bank reserves, approximately $300 billion held in European and American institutions, They demonstrated that sovereign assets in Western financial systems were vulnerable to political decisions. This action crossed a threshold that had previously been considered almost sacrosanct. Freezing the assets of individuals, companies, even specific banks was accepted practice. But freezing the sovereign reserves of a nation's central bank was extraordinary. It signaled that the rules governing international finance could be suspended when Western powers deemed it necessary. This was not lost on other countries. If Russia's reserves could be frozen, so could anyone's. China holds over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. If tensions over Taiwan escalate, could those holdings be frozen too? Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other Gulf states hold hundreds of billions in Western assets. Every finance ministry and central bank globally had to reassess the risk of holding reserves in dollars and euros. The result has been accelerated diversification. Central banks are increasing gold holdings at the fastest pace in decades. According to World Gold Council data, central banks purchased over 1,000 tons of gold in 2022, the highest level since 1967. This isn't coincidence. It's a flight to assets that cannot be frozen by foreign governments. Countries are also buying more assets denominated in alternative currencies. The euro, yen, and yuan are all seeing increased use as reserve currencies, though the dollar remains dominant. More significantly, some countries are holding fewer reserves overall, preferring to maintain currency swap lines with multiple partners, rather than accumulating assets in any single currency. China and Russia now settle increasing amounts of bilateral trade in yuan and rubles, rather than dollars. Before 2022, roughly 90% of Russia-China trade was denominated in dollars or euros. By 2024, that figure had dropped below 30%, with the yuan accounting for the majority of transactions and rubles making up much of the remainder. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are actively discussing alternatives to dollar-dominated trade. Saudi Arabia, which has priced oil in dollars exclusively since the 1970s, is now accepting yuan for some Chinese oil purchases. These changes happen slowly and won't eliminate dollar dominance in the near term, but they represent the early stages of a fundamental shift. The dollar's role as global reserve currency has been a cornerstone of American economic and geopolitical power for 80 years. It allows the United States to run persistent trade deficits, borrow at lower rates, and impose sanctions effectively because dollar transactions must clear through American financial institutions. If that dominance erodes, and erosion is precisely what's happening, American economic leverage diminishes proportionally. The sanctions weapon depends on targets needing access to dollar-based financial systems. If alternative systems emerge, the weapon becomes less effective. The technology dimension demonstrates similar unintended consequences. Western sanctions restricted Russia's access to advanced semiconductors, aerospace technology, and other high-tech goods. The goal was to cripple Russia's military-industrial capacity and technological development. But restrictions on Russia accelerated its domestic technology development and deepened technological cooperation with China. Russia cannot manufacture cutting-edge semiconductors domestically, but it can obtain them through Chinese intermediaries. Chinese companies facing their own Western technology restrictions have strong incentives to develop alternatives to American and European technology. This creates a bifurcating global technology ecosystem, one centered on Western standards and supply chains, another developing around Chinese technology with participation from Russia and other sanctioned or potentially sanctioned nations. In the long run, this bifurcation may prove far more costly to Western technology dominance than any individual sanctions regime could justify. Canada's recent $500 billion economic diversification strategy illustrates how sanctions-related uncertainties are reshaping allies' calculations. Canada wasn't sanctioned, but watched America weaponize trade relationships through tariffs and threats even against close partners. The lesson was clear. Economic dependence on any single partner, even a reliable one, creates vulnerability. Canada's response was to systematically reduce dependence on U.S. markets from 75% to below 60% of exports over a decade, while building alternative relationships with Asian and European partners. This isn't hostility to the United States. It's rational risk management in an environment where economic relationships can be weaponized unpredictably. If even Canada, America's closest ally and most integrated trading partner, is deliberately reducing economic ties due to weaponization concerns, what are other countries doing? The answer is they're all building redundancy, reducing dependence, and creating alternatives to Western-dominated systems wherever possible. The middle power response has been particularly significant. Countries like Turkey, UAE, Indonesia, and Brazil are positioning themselves as intermediaries who can trade with both Western and non-Western economic blocs. They refuse to fully align with either side, maintaining relationships with everyone precisely to avoid being vulnerable to sanctions from any direction. Turkey provides a fascinating case study. As a NATO member, Turkey faces pressure to align with Western sanctions policies. Yet Turkey has maintained economic ties with Russia throughout the Ukraine war, positioning itself as a mediator and keeping trade channels open. Turkish companies have become intermediaries for goods that can no longer flow directly between Russia and the West. Turkish banks process transactions that Western banks won't handle. This isn't defiance of the West. It's pragmatic positioning to benefit economically from fragmentation. The United Arab Emirates has played a similar role. Dubai has long been a trading hub, and its importance has grown as companies seek jurisdictions that facilitate rather than restrict international commerce. Russian oligarchs moved assets to UAE. Russian businesses established subsidiaries there. Gold flows through Dubai refineries. Diamonds transit through UAE cutting centers. The UAE enforces few Western sanctions strictly, making it an increasingly important node in the global economy for those seeking to avoid restrictions. Indonesia, the world's fourth most populous nation, has explicitly rejected pressure to choose sides. Indonesian officials state that their country will maintain relations with all major powers and will not subordinate Indonesian interests to any external conflict. This position resonates domestically and positions Indonesia as a neutral ground for businesses from all sides. Brazil, under various governments, has maintained independence from Western pressure on sanctions. Brazilian officials argue that sanctions are counterproductive and that Brazil will trade with any country that wants to trade with Brazil. This position enjoys broad domestic support across the political spectrum, as Brazilians generally resent external pressure to take positions on conflicts they don't see as directly relevant to Brazilian interests. This strategic hedging makes sanctions less effective because it creates escape routes and alternative channels. When the United States sanctioned Venezuelan oil, Asian refiners bought it anyway through intermediary companies. When Europe sanctioned Russian diamonds, they continued entering markets through cutting centers in India and UAE. When financial transactions couldn't go through Western banks, they went through banks in Turkey, UAE, and China. The global economy is so interconnected and sophisticated that determined actors can almost always find workarounds. The humanitarian dimension complicates the picture further. Comprehensive sanctions inevitably harm civilian populations, often severely. Iraq, under sanctions in the 1990s, experienced catastrophic child mortality increases. Venezuelan sanctions contributed to economic collapse and humanitarian crisis, even while failing to achieve regime change. Iranian sanctions have made medicine and medical equipment harder to obtain, directly impacting health outcomes. Defenders argue that sanctions are still preferable to military action, and that humanitarian exemptions can mitigate civilian harm. Critics respond that exemptions rarely work effectively in practice, and that inflicting widespread civilian suffering to pressure governments is both morally questionable and strategically counterproductive, often strengthening rather than weakening targeted regimes. But the strategic question is more fundamental. Do sanctions actually change behavior? The record is mixed at best. Sanctions contributed to South Africa's transition from apartheid and to Libya's abandonment of nuclear weapons, but they failed to dislodge regimes in Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and Syria. They didn't prevent Russia's invasion of Ukraine despite years of Crimea-related sanctions that were explicitly designed to deter exactly that escalation. The most comprehensive academic studies find that sanctions succeed in changing target behavior roughly 30% of the time, and primarily in cases involving limited objectives against weak states. Against major powers with strong state capacity and access to alternative economic partners, sanctions rarely achieve stated objectives. Why do policymakers continue deploying a tool with such a poor success rate? Several factors explain this. Sanctions provide a visible response that demonstrates resolve without the political costs of military action or the appearance of inaction. They satisfy domestic audiences demanding that something be done, and the costs of sanctions to the imposing countries are typically diffuse and delayed, while the benefits, even if largely symbolic, are immediate and politically valuable. But the cumulative effect of decades of expanding sanctions use is now becoming apparent. The global economy is reorganizing around the reality that Western economic power can be weaponized unpredictably. Countries are rationally responding by reducing their vulnerability to that weaponization. Consider the infrastructure being built. China has developed CIPS, an alternative to SWIFT for Yuan-denominated transactions. Russia has SPFS, its own financial messaging system. These systems are less efficient and less comprehensive than SWIFT, but they function, and every country that joins them reduces SWIFT's, and therefore Western, leverage. The Belt and Road Initiative, whatever its other purposes, creates economic relationships and infrastructure that function outside Western financial oversight. Digital currencies being developed by China and others could enable international transactions that bypass traditional banking systems entirely. Alternative credit rating agencies challenge Western institutions' monopoly on creditworthiness assessments. None of these alternatives currently matches Western systems in efficiency, scale, or reliability. But they don't need to match them. They just need to be adequate. And adequacy is exactly what's being achieved, step by step, investment by investment, transaction by transaction. The geopolitical implications extend beyond economics. The post-World War II international order was built substantially on economic interdependence, managed through Western-dominated institutions, the IMF, World Bank, WTO, and dollar-based financial systems. American and European power derived significantly from their centrality to this system. If parallel systems emerge that allow major economies to function outside Western institutional control, the foundation of that power erodes. This doesn't mean Western collapse or irrelevance. The United States and Europe remain enormously wealthy and technologically advanced. But it means a transition from unipolar economic dominance to a multipolar system where Western institutions are one option among several rather than the only viable option. Some analysts argue this transition was inevitable, regardless of sanctions. Rising powers naturally seek autonomy and resist subordination to systems designed by others. There's truth to this, but sanctions have dramatically accelerated the process. They've provided both the motivation, fear of being sanctioned, and the justification, building sanctions-proof alternatives for creating parallel systems that might otherwise have developed much more slowly. The Ukraine war and resulting sanctions may be remembered historically, not primarily for their impact on Russia, but for marking the moment when the post-Cold War Western economic dominance began its irreversible decline. Not through military defeat or ideological failure, but through the unintended consequences of weaponizing economic interdependence. What are the alternatives? Some argue for more targeted sanctions focusing on specific individuals and entities rather than comprehensive economic warfare. This is less economically disruptive, but also less impactful. Others suggest multilateral sanctions through the UN are more legitimate, but these are nearly impossible to achieve when major powers disagree. Some propose abandoning sanctions entirely and relying on diplomacy or accepting that some regimes will act contrary to Western preferences. This is politically unpalatable and may indeed be too passive, but it recognizes that tools that don't work shouldn't be used just because alternatives are unsatisfying. The most sophisticated view acknowledges that sanctions can be useful in limited circumstances against specific targets, but that their overuse has created strategic costs exceeding tactical benefits. Like any tool, sanctions have appropriate applications. The problem is they've been applied so broadly and ambitiously that they've triggered systemic responses undermining their future utility. Looking forward, several scenarios appear possible. One is continued fragmentation. The world divides into economic blocks that trade internally, but not across block boundaries. This would reverse globalization and likely reduce overall economic growth, but might stabilize as a new equilibrium. Another is Western adaptation. Sanctions are used much more selectively, only in cases where success is highly probable and where the strategic value clearly exceeds the costs. This would require admitting that many past sanctions were mistakes, which is politically difficult. A third possibility is accelerated decline of Western economic leverage as parallel systems mature. In this scenario, sanctions become largely irrelevant within a decade or two because targets can simply route around Western financial systems entirely. The actual future will likely combine elements of all three scenarios, varying by region and issue. But the fundamental dynamic is clear. The more aggressively economic interdependence is weaponized, the more motivated other actors become to reduce their vulnerability to that weaponization. This is the paradox. Sanctions are most effective when the target has no alternatives and fears future sanctions enough to comply. But using sanctions teaches targets to build alternatives and demonstrates to observers that they need sanctions-proof systems. The more you use the weapon, the less effective it becomes. The United States and Europe retain enormous economic power, but power is relative, and effectiveness depends on leverage. A weapon that prompts adversaries and even allies to systematically reduce your leverage is one that diminishes your power even as you deploy it. The sanctions regime built over the past 3 decades achieved some tactical successes, but its strategic consequence has been to motivate construction of alternative economic architectures that will constrain Western power for decades to come. The weapon was real. The consequences are real. But they're not what policymakers intended. This is the economic warfare paradox. The more comprehensively you deploy economic coercion, the more certainly you undermine the foundations of future economic leverage. And unlike military weapons that can be rebuilt or diplomatic capital that can be restored, the trust and interdependence that made economic sanctions effective cannot easily be reconstructed once it's been deliberately destroyed. The question now is whether policymakers recognize this dynamic before the damage becomes irreversible, or whether the seductive logic of economic coercion will continue driving decisions until the West wakes up to discover it has sanctioned itself out of economic primacy.